Hey everybody, welcome back. This is help with homework number 5 for chapter 5 for Econ 100B. Today I'm going to go over 3 problems that people asked me about. Problem 13, which is also 5.8 in the book. Problem 14, which is 5.11 in the book. And problem 17. So all of these are MyLab problems, and usually there is a version of them in the textbook and then versions of them with slightly different numbers in the MyLab problems. And so what you'll get is the technique. The numbers might not be identical, but it should be enough to get you going. So these are all problems that look at applications of consumer choice. The first one, number 13, looks at the effect of winning the lottery on someone's budget constraint. So you start out with a clean whiteboard and a budget constraint. Ooh, that is a brand new pen. I'll just save that for a rainy day. That looks at consumption of other goods and leisure time. And so we want to remember that our leisure time is N and our work hours are H. And there is this boundary at 24 hours because you can't work or spend more than 24 hours a day in leisure. And then we have some given budget constraint, L1. And L1 is where this person starts out. And we have a couple of underlying assumptions. The price of consumption, which is everything else, is basically $1 per unit of goods. And we want to remember something here because this problem says that what happens when this person wins the lottery. So one thing you want to remember is that we talked about how income is wages times hours worked plus exogenous income or exogenous wealth. And that's what we're going to be seeing here. Winning the lottery is like giving somebody more money, right? Not that they're working more. It's not changing this part of the equation. It's changing this part of the equation. So we're going to have the change be that Y star is that this person is all of a sudden winning $365,000. What is that going to do to their budget constraint? And the reality is that's just a change in income. It's just going to shift it up, right? Just going to shift it straight up. So winning the lottery shifts the budget constraint up by the size of the winnings. So you want to shift it up with the same slope because this person's wages haven't changed. And that's going to give us the winning budget constraint LW. The next part of the question says this person, Joe, works the same amount of hours in a given day. So what is the income effect? And asks if it's positive, negative, or zero. And the main thing here is in that fact that Joe doesn't change his consumption of work hours. It doesn't change how much he works. So if he worked this number of hours before, now he works the same number of hours and just consumes more of everything else. Not perfect. My slope should be a little bit higher here, but the idea is the slope hasn't changed. The number of hours worked hasn't changed. And so there's no income effect on Joe's consumption of leisure, right? He's not consuming more leisure because of this change in wealth. And so the income effect is actually zero. And that's going to be important for the next part. The next part asks to imagine what if Joe gets an increase in wages on the exact same day. So if Joe's wages go up on the exact same day, that's going to be shifting that budget constraint up, rotating it up from its point. Remember, the slope of the budget constraint is negative W, or the opposite of the wage. So if the budget constraint goes up, if the wages go up, we're going to see the budget constraint get steeper, and that's going to be our L, what is it, 2 or 3? We're going to call it L2. And so that's going to mean that now Joe is on an even higher budget constraint. The last question asks whether there's going to be a positive. If there's a positive substitution effect, what are we going to see the total effect be? It's asking about the substitution effect, the income effect, and the total effect. We know that the income effect is already zero. if we see that Joe substitutes more work and less leisure as a result of these higher wages, then we're going to see that substitution effect take place, which makes sense. As Joe's wages go up, the opportunity cost of leisure and the value of working is going to increase. And so we're going to expect to see Joe's consumption points shift out to, say, here, where he's consuming more of everything. And so we're going to see a positive substitution effect. And if the substitution effect is positive and the income effect is 0, then the total effect is positive. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So positive substitution effect, Joe substitutes more work hours as the wage rises for less leisure time. And so the total effect is positive. That's it. That's number 13. Number 14 looks at a similar situation, but now we want to look at the effect of different ways of subsidizing childcare for an individual. And this gets at sort of one of the big questions in the book. At the very, very beginning of the chapter and at the end of the chapter, we were talking about the effect of different types of subsidies, specifically talking about childcare. So we've got the same framework where someone consumes, that's the next one. This is the number 14. Number 13 is the childcare one, or number 17 is the childcare one. Number 14 looks at the effect of a progressive tax and a progressive tax and a flat tax. So we've got the same situation here where we've got consuming leisure or work. And we've got some initial budget constraint, L1, and our individuals are going to consume Y at a price of $1 per unit. And then we're going to have, and it should say on your graph, there's some point where they tell us what where $1,000 is. And they say that there is going to be a flat tax for any income earned over $1,000. And this is where we get a kinked budget curve. So here's how it's going to look. You're not going to see any tax on any income up until that $1,000 mark. And then after that $1,000 mark, the tax is going to lower our consumers' ability to purchase goods and services. It's not going to affect this part here. It's going to affect this part here. So it's going to shift this curve like that. And so you're going to have a flatter curve here and the exact same curve below that $1,000 mark. Okay? Kind of makes sense, hopefully. Let me know if it doesn't. The next part asks about a progressive tax, and the progressive tax is going to be more kinked than this one because it would probably have, they give you a picture of it in the MyLab because they'd see another kink as the curve gets flatter at another level of income. And what we want to think about here is that how the progressive tax is going to affect production. Is it going to increase production or decrease production? And basically what we're trying to get at is, what is this tax going to do to a worker's incentive to work? And so the progressive tax is only going to increase production if the substitution effect is larger than the income effect. And that just means that if the progressive tax increases our substitutability of working more to make more money relative to the income effect, if the substitution effect is larger than that income effect of feeling poorer, we're going to expect production to increase. Does that make sense? Kind of, hopefully. The last one is the childcare one, and it says looking at a hourly childcare subsidy and the effects of an hourly childcare subsidy show that a lump sum or a cash grant would get us to the same indifference curve with less income. And this kind of is what I talked about. We talked about this with the food stamps last chapter. It's in the beginning and the end of this chapter. And it's this idea we talked about in the beginning of this chapter about how whether a policy is effective or not depends on what your goals are. If your goal is to increase consumption of food or housing, or if your goal is to just raise utility. So let's start out with a household that consumes childcare and everything else. And we're going to give them some initial indifference curve. Let's say that's their initial indifference curve, L1, with some consumption point, Q1, Y1, and there's some indifference curve associated with that. And then we can show that a per hour subsidy for childcare, or an hourly childcare subsidy, is going to lower the cost of childcare. I'm going to go ahead and stretch this out a little bit. There we go. Now we can do this work. It's going to lower the cost of childcare, meaning that this curve is going to flatten out as our household consumes more childcare. We're going to call this L2. And that's going to get us to a point where they consume a little bit more of everything else because of the income effect, and a lot more childcare because of the substitution effect. And that gives us a new consumption point and a new indifference curve. Let's fix that. I'll make it a little bit more. Okay. And so we have a consumption point E1 and E2. So what the question is asking you to do is prove that you can get to that higher indifference curve, E2, with less money through a grant or just pure cash, giving them a lump sum. So what you want to do then is, rather than lowering the cost of childcare, we want to shift that budget constraint out. And if you look at it visually, you can see that that slope is going to hit that indifference curve at that indifference curve at a different point. And it's usually going to be a lower point than what we achieved on this hourly subsidy. So I'm going to try and let's see if I can make sure these curves are drawn just the right way. It's going to be easier to do. This is one of those ones that's easier to do in MyLab because it's very precise and handwriting isn't always. So I want to make this tangent to indifference curve 2, and on the same slope, having the same slope as L1, but tangent to indifference curve 2. And we can see that we can be on that same indifference curve, E3. We're going to consume a little bit more childcare than in the initial case, but less than with the hourly subsidy. And we're going to see them consume more of everything else. And that's going to mean that this household is actually better off with less money. A lower expenditure that's just a lump sum is going to get them to that same indifference curve with a different combination of goods. And that's what we tend to see with policies. With these aid policies, the aid policies that prioritize goods-specific or service-specific aid, things like housing vouchers, food stamps, hourly childcare subsidies, they're good at increasing consumption of the specified good, but they're not an efficient way of raising the utility of the household in poverty. What's more efficient is just giving them the money, some amount of money. You can still get to that same indifference curve, but it's going to be a different combination of goods than policymakers might have in mind, because the household knows better what the actual combination of goods that gets them to that higher utility level is. So this is a not uncommon finding. The problem is that, we have to specify what the goal of the policy is. Is the goal of the policy to make low-income households better off, raise their utility, or is the goal of the policy to just increase childcare consumption? So hopefully that makes sense. Like I said, that's a problem that is based on the very, very beginning, the intro to Chapter 5 and the summary of Chapter 5. So hopefully that helps with the homework. Let me know what questions you have and have a great day.